Thanks for joining us for a reflection on Mark chapter 1, verses 1 to 8. It's great that you're able to join us this time. Now, I wonder if you recall a time when you were commuting to work, trying to work your way through a traffic jam. And on the rare occasion, recently I managed to get on an essential journey. I took a shortcut thinking it would be quicker, but there were traffic lights. There seemed to be everywhere, and it took longer than I thought it would. I don't know about you, but Google Maps can be a great guide. I wasn't using it then, otherwise I might have known. It helps you find a way through traffic jams, giving you an obvious alternative route. But then, even with a familiar route, there could be an accident, and it warns you even then. And even if you're in the queue of traffic, it says you're still in the quickest route, it will take you 15 minutes to wait and get through. Now, I know for many of us, we probably actually grew up in a generation where we knew nothing of that kind of stuff for our car and travelling on our journey. And we would get frustrated maybe at other drivers or impatient with ourselves, and then trying to turn up and explain, well, it was the roadworks, seems rather lame to your boss or your appointment where you're late for. I don't know what, in terms of your own life, what you've been through, but maybe similarly, maybe we've been on a bumpy road in our lives. Maybe that's been a closed road or a dead end road, or maybe you've taken a wrong turn. Maybe you've made a mistake and people have been hurt by you. Maybe you face challenges daily in how you view yourself, and you wonder how on earth anyone could love who you are, including God. Maybe you're in a roadblock at the moment in your life caused by circumstances out with your control, whether spiritually, emotionally or relationally. The prophet Isaiah, Mark in our readings today, Mark being Peter's traveller's companion, wrote to two very different times, but we're saying the same truth, that God is in the business of spiritual road construction in the midst of our lives. So, to clear the way and to lay down that highway so there's nothing that gets in between God and God's people. Now, God is going to move heaven and hell to get through to you and me, over, around, under, whatever it is, to stay connected with you. How? Well, the short answer is Jesus. Now, you might say, so come on, you can't put it down to one word or one person. Well, this passage describes the start of that spiritual road and works to see how we could clear the way towards that. So what does it look like? How is that possible? How can a word or a name such as Jesus be sufficient an answer? Well, what we're discovering here is who he is and what he's done. And at this time of Advent and Christmas, there's a lot for us to see in the reading we have today that gets us off to a good start for that. And Mark is in the business of sharing a good news story here, and he's saying there is a way, and this is it. You will find in my story of Jesus that there is so much more. And the clue is also in the verse he quotes from the prophet Isaiah. As we have seen from our reading, it comes from Isaiah 40. Again, it is the beginning of a major section of Isaiah's second book in his trilogy of prophecies, a time when God's people needed comfort and to be reassured that they could return safely to their spiritual home. Now, the Good News Bible probably hides the meaning of that particular verse, but another version puts it this way: Comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and proclaim to her that her hard service has been completed, that her sin has been paid for, that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. Now, the phrase double for all her sins doesn't mean that God's giving them an even harder time. It's actually the opposite. The word double in this verse only happens once elsewhere in the Bible, and it's translated like many sides, like a blanket you fold away into the cupboard has many sides. But it also refers to an ancient custom where it's almost the doubling is of a doubling of a piece of paper, folding it over, when really what happens is you're halving the paper and you're making it look half. And what happened was that if someone was poor, wasn't able to pay their debts, the amount was written on one side, folded over, the person who was going to pay for it wrote their name there, everyone knew what was happening, and then they knew that that was it over. So one person put it this way a few years back: the heart of the Old Testament, this is Isaiah 40 verse 1, the comfort of God gives is the comfort of a God who forgives the worst of sins and who rescues from the direst of situations. See, Isaiah and Mark both are saying to their readers, it doesn't seem like it, but it's going to change for the better. Isaiah's words were to be read in a time when God's people had been in exile for ages. Mark was sharing something in a time when God had been silent with God's people for 400 years. Both speaking clearly of a highway where something was going to happen to declutter our lives, where choices and habits and attitudes and beliefs could be swept aside so that God and us can connect once more. I recall a time when I was travelling home from my chaplaincy work from York Hill Children's Hospital, and I'd travel into town, into the centre, and pick up my daughter at the end of the day at art school, and I'd jump into the front passenger seat and she would then be in the driver's seat as a learner, and we would go home, but we'd go via the city centre and Union Street where all the bus routes converged, and we'd head out towards Queen's Park and head south. Now, Union Street was a nightmare, and I would have to alert her to the behaviour of the traffic and what was going to happen as she learned. Talk about diving into the deep end of learning. Well, I think I deserved, and probably her even more, a medal. And remember, you might recall from a previous time I chatted that I vowed never to teach my daughter to drive because, well, when she was 5, she and I just were at loggerheads when she was trying to be learning the bike. But what I'm trying to say out of this in my explanation is that warnings and alertnesses in driving is the same as what God is trying to do. You need someone beside you to help clear the way in your mind about what's happening. And you see, John the Baptist in our reading this morning was saying that really the listeners needed to turn around and almost declutter and clear up the mess that's in their lives so that they could be sensitive to how Jesus could be so important to them. Going back to my story with my daughter, there'll be a point in our journeys where we would just chat. She would ask a question about how do you cope with working in York Hill, deal with these sick children and the emotions you must go through. And I kind of described it like a traffic jam where you get up to one point, you get stuck, you even have to stop, and then you just have to wait, and then it allows you to move forward once more. And the emotions can often be like that. And in all of that, this can happen in our lives too. We can be going along in our lives perfectly okay, but then there's times when we can get stuck, even stop. And that can also relate to our faith. And we need friends and family maybe to help us to get unstuck, to come alongside us and to get us through. A person like what John the Baptist was in our reading, we do need help, and we can help each other. I can say that now because during that time when you feel stuck or even stopped, you can feel like where is your faith? Oh, what's going on? Have I lost it? Is it still there? And I say that carefully because I know now looking back, God's faith was still in me, even during that time when I was stuck or stopped. Now we use kind of big words in Christianity to describe that kind of activity, and that is what's called grace and mercy. This is where I sum it up in the person or the word as Jesus. He didn't abandon me, and he doesn't need and will not abandon you. You see, even sometimes our mental health clouds our thinking, and we don't see the world in a good way, and sometimes emotions get the better of us, and a kind of red mist descends, and the anger makes us take rash judgments or say harsh words. Sometimes our view of God can be affected too, and we need to help clear those thoughts and calm those emotions and revisit our faith and carefully chat it through with someone trustworthy to have that better understanding once more. And therefore we can get a better understanding of who God is, even in that situation. The surprising thing is when we take those steps, it feels like as Jesus can turn up in our lives. But when that happens, we need to be receptive, but then also aware that maybe he was there all along. And that's where grace, mercy, and peace come into our lives through God. So in this time of Advent, to be alert and watchful and to be ready for God, to change our lives, we need to take some steps to counter the clutter that's accumulated over this period of time, or this past year. We may have emotional baggage to unpack. We may need to unburden our worries or untangle ourselves from poor choices like clothes that we can trip up over on a floor that we haven't tidied away. A way to be ready is to realise that we are vulnerable. Trying to be self-sufficient, independent, and conveying we're strong denies the reality we are nothing but. Readiness for God is admitting we are vulnerable as the grass of the field, as it says in our passage this morning. Are we ready to admit we cannot live this life on our own? Have we ever asked for help and admitted why? Maybe this should be our prayer today, quietly to ourselves. That's a starting point. It can be scary to take this first step, but that leads to another practical step. The passage we read from Isaiah in chapter 40 tells us not to be afraid. And that phrase is repeated a further 9 times in that chapter. One way to be ready for God is to calm ourselves in the midst of the crazy year we have. And fear is natural in our response, but that doesn't mean it should control us. We need to name our fears. We might even need to write them down. We might need some help. Share them with someone who can trust and see how real and big they are when we chat them through with someone else. It can feel different afterwards. Do you have someone to do that with? Maybe if you don't, you can give me a call and we can see what we can do together. Are we ready to cast out fear? Is it an ongoing process? But it's best to get started with it. Another way to be ready and watchful for God is to recognise God's character as good. The reading in Mark speaks of good news. Isaiah speaks of good news of God's tenderness, looking for the good in the life and being tender-hearted makes us ready and alert to recognise through our lives that God is good and that he cares, that God is fond of us and knows our needs like a shepherd knows his flock. And if we mirror that soft and open-hearted approach, we become ready for God to work in and through us. Are we ready to be open-hearted? You might say, "Oh, Alice, that sounds great, but I still don't feel ready, and if I'm ready, can God use me?" Well, there is a wee gem in the start of Mark's good news story, the promise of God's Spirit in us. And this is what this readiness is all about, ready for God to live in us so we can live out who God is in the world. Are we ready for God to live in us so we can live out what God is in this world? Above all else, this is my prayer for you today, that God's Spirit fills you with love overflowing, showing courage that what we have is good. It is the good news that is nothing less than Jesus living in us. Thanks for coming to the end of our reflection. Hope you can join us another time. Take care.